In this Codex review, we'll be covering the Imperial Guard, or Astra Militarum. Before we get started, I'll go over the star system again. A 1-star unit is an underpowered unit. They either need points decrease or a reworking of their rules to be viable. A 2-star unit slightly underperforms, however it can do damage with either stratagems or other supporting units. A 3-star unit is a viable choice in both casual and a slightly competitive setting, although it isn't always necessarily the optimal choice. A 4-star unit is a tech choice in a competitive list. It crops up here and there, and is usually more powerful than the average 3-star unit. Finally, a 5-star unit is a staple in both competitive and casual lists. Usually it is hard to make viable armies without these, or they are part of an incredibly powerful strategy in a competitive setting. I would just like to note before starting this list that a lot of competitive guard armies uses soup. Knights, Custodes, Marines, Assassins, and even the Mechanicum all show up inside of guard lists. This is because the guard does not need a lot of units to create good synergy, and also is good at holding objectives, as well as being very cheap for the command points they can generate. One final thing I'd like to note is that I've taken into account the chapter approved changes where I could find them, although overall they haven't made as much of a difference to the guard as they have for the orcs. Alright, let's begin. Starting at 1 star, we have the conscripts. Conscripts cost the same amount of points as the infantry squads. They are objectively worse than infantry squads with the inability to take heavy weapons teams, special weapons, having a lower ballistic skill, having a lower weapons skill, and having a significantly lower leadership, as well as also not always listening to the voice of command. And for this upside, all you can do is take them in squad sizes of 20 or 30. Next up we have the Master of Ordnance. The Master of Ordnance is essentially playing 30 points to do almost nothing. You can do your artillery barge once a game, and even then it only has a 50-50 chance of even hitting anything. On top of that, it isn't guaranteed mortal wounds, so you're not even paying 30 points to get some guaranteed damage on the board. The only other advantage he has is the ability to reroll ones, and if you really desperately wanted to do that, you could quite easily choose the Cadian Doctrine and just not move, especially seeing as the things that he benefits are artillery pieces that are sitting in the back line, not moving anyway. Servitors are next, and they have an incredibly low ballistic skill, an incredibly low weapon skill, and only really usable when you have a tech priest nearby. Even with the tech priest nearby, it only improves it to a 4-up, and considering that most of the guns they can bring are heavy weapons, and you need to move your units to get them in range, they're going to be mostly hitting on 5-ups regardless. Without the tech priest, they're hitting on 6-ups, which is so ridiculously bad that you're forced to bring them. And if you're bringing the tech priest, and they're committing to the servitors as well, you might as well just switch over to a Mechanicum army, which has a lot better options than servitors as well. The officer of the fleet only really supplies the occasional mortal wounds. It's like having a long-range Psyker that can only use smite, that can trigger off any range, but also can't deny the witch. For your 20 points, there's definitely better stuff out there. Next up in the 1-star category is Commissar Seravina Rain. She's on here because she is essentially a commissar, except you're paying over double the price to occasionally completely negate morale. As she's just a regular commissar, she doesn't have any invuln saves or any other bonuses that can help her survive in close combat, which is where she wants to be able to get the auto-passing morale. Next up in the 1-star category is the Deathstrike Missile Launcher. The Deathstrike Missile Launcher suffers from so many restrictions that it just makes it almost completely unusable and far too swingy to ever consider using. First of all, you need to wait until at least the second battle round to even have a chance of firing it, and even then that's only a 1 in 6 chance. Once you've passed this chance, you then have to hit it, although at least when you hit it you have the courtesy of auto-dealing mortal wounds. The problem is, by the time you're on the 2nd, 3rd, 4th or even 5th turn, the turns you'll actually be able to shoot it, most of the enemy will spread out, so the mortal wounds spilling over will not be as effective. In its current state, it is essentially unusable, especially for its points. Next up is the 2-star category. First of all, we have Lord Commissars. There are better HQ options for the guard to take. If you're going to take a commissar, you might as well take the cheaper regular commissar, especially seeing as they are more of a support unit than a frontline combat unit. Next up in the 2-star category is the Tempestor Prime. The Tempestor Prime ends up being almost exactly the same as a company commander, except you have to pay the points to be able to use its voice of command twice. You can get the option to take better weapons, and you also have the option to be able to deep strike him, though these upsides really don't add up to make its points cost worth it. Next up is Colour Sergeant Kell. Usually I haven't found the guard being in need of extra commands. You should have enough company commanders, especially as Cadians, to be able to spam out voice of command to all the troops you need to. The bodyguard ability really isn't that necessary, especially seeing as if you are running Creed, you should be keeping him safe anyway. And then finally, the ability to re-roll morale really isn't that much of an issue. Again, just bring commissars if you're worried about morale. Next up in the 2-star category is Sly Marbo. The problem with Sly Marbo is he is far too squishy for what he wants to do. So what you want to be doing with Sly Marbo is deep striking him near characters, picking them off, hiding him again, and deep striking him again. The problem is you have a full enemies shooting and charge and fight phases that you have to survive in order to get Sly Marbo off the board again. So usually he could maybe assassinate one character if he's lucky. He does have decent weapons and he has got incredibly good accuracy with a good 2-up and 2-up for both weapon skill and ballistic skill, but the points you have to pay for him to maybe kill one character really doesn't make him worth it. Next up we have the Special Weapons Squad. Special Weapons Squads fall flat a little bit because the special weapons usually aren't worth taking. If you need to be able to take out vehicles and the like, you usually just slap them on a Lehman Russ. And taking out infantry you can just do with a large amount of regular infantry guardsman fire. Sergeant Harker has decent stats, although his only ability is to reroll hit rolls of 1. This is fine as Catachans can benefit from it. I could see you getting some use out of him, but overall I don't think he is that worth it for his 50-point cost. Next in the 2-star category is Veterans. Veterans behave very similarly to infantry squads, and they have a slightly improved ballistic skill. Aside from that, there's nothing else to it, so it probably isn't worth the points hike. Next up in 2-star is Militarum Tempestus Command Squads. I don't think you need to take these, especially seeing as they don't get an improvement on their ballistic skill over the regular command squads. The slight edge they get over them is they have slightly better hotshot guns and they have a slightly better save. Overall, it's not worth it for the extra points cost. The Adeptus Ministorum Priest also comes in at 2 stars. Usually I'd say things that make your infantry guard better in melee are not worth taking, however it is always worth considering for the Bullgrins. The extra attack you get isn't really worth the points cost of it. The rerolls are reasonably nice, and the Ministorum Priest himself is quite tanky, but overall I don't think you want a large commitment of melee in your guard army. Another 2-star is the Crusader, although I could see them perhaps being bumped up to 3 stars after the chapter approved points cut. I'm only putting them down here because melee guard doesn't tend to be that good. They can't benefit from the Catachan Regiment doctrine due to the fact they are not strictly guard units, and they are banking far too much on their 3-up invulnerable save to make up for their really weak toughness. Nork Dedok is a more expensive Ogren bodyguard. He has a slightly better default save, however he can't take either of the shields, which either improve their invuln save or their regular saves. The only other advantage that Nork has over the regular Ogren bodyguard is the ability to fight after he's killed, which is okay. Hellhounds, Devil Dogs and Bane Wolves are all 2 stars. They're all too short range and too squishy to be usable. You can't deep strike them easily, and even if they can explode better in the case of the Hellhounds, it really is a bit too much points investment to just throw away into the enemy lines. Next up is the Armoured Sentinels. The Armoured Sentinels have a slightly better toughness and save than the Scout Sentinels. However, they suffer from the same issue as them, which is that they are both equipped with only heavy weapons that don't have very long range, and they're also a fast moving unit, which means you're incentivized to stay on the move. However, they don't get the ability to fire heavy weapons and move without suffering the penalty, which means they're consistently hitting on 5-ups. When you're shooting at 5-up, unless you have a significant volume of fire, it generally isn't worth considering. Next up is the Chimera, and while you can transform this into a command box transporting around your units that have voice of command, it isn't worth paying the points that it is to have the shell to protect your characters, especially seeing as you have the 8th edition rules that means you can screen out with regular infantry. It isn't even worth transporting that regular infantry further towards the front. Most of the time you can make it up the board with good advances or deep strikes. The Torok suffers the same issues as the Chimera despite being 50 points cheaper. The only slight edge the Torok has, with it being cheaper, means that you could potentially use it to hide Ogrins or Bullgrins in, which could be quite a nice surprise. The Torok's Prime is just a more expensive Torok's really. You can equip better guns on it and it has a better ballistic skill, however at its only toughness of 6 it could easily be focused down, and for its 80 points cost it generally isn't worth doing. Moving into the 3-star category, we start with Creed. Creed is pretty good. He can spam out a lot of voice of commands, and he can stay in the backline and stay alive at a reasonable rate. He has invuln saves, which is nice if he's getting sniped at by enemy characters. He's worth considering for your Warlord as he gives you extra command points and also has great synergy with the Cadian Warlord trait. Commissar Yarrick is 3 stars. He's an absolute beast in melee combat and is almost impossible to kill. He also boosts nearby infantry squads to a leadership of 9, which is very good for keeping them from running away. Leadership 9 is up there with Space Marines for how good it is. The only thing that really drags him down is his very high points cost, especially when you consider that a regular commissar is only 15 points. Yarrick is up at just over 100 thanks to his Stormbolter. Next up in 3 stars we have the Militarum Tempestus Scions. This might be a bit of a low rating for me, especially seeing as they have Deep Strike, which is invaluable, and they also got a points cut recently. They also are troops choices, which gives them priority on objectives. I can easily see them making it up into 4 stars, although it will require a bit of experimentation. The ability to nab objectives on turn 3 is really good, especially with their decent ballistic skill, good hotshot las rifles, and the fact that they are slightly tankier than regular guardsmen. Next up in the 3-star category is the Command Squads. This is one of those personal experience things. I found Command Squads have been performing reasonably well. You can use their cheeky medkit boys to be able to restore members of the squad if they're getting picked off. They also have a decent ballistic skill, so you can try dumb stuff like throwing 3 plasmas in for a relatively cheap price. The Regimental Standard is also quite a nice buff, although I don't think it's worth the points cost it has. Although the ability to give your infantry leadership 10 with Yarrick and the Regimental Standard is quite cheeky. Most of the time when guardsmen die, they die as a whole squad though, so not that useful. Next up in the 3-star category is the Commissar. The Commissar is great at giving your troops a little extra buff in their leadership. Admittedly, most guardsman squads already have a leadership of 7 because you keep the sergeant alive for so long, but if you have squads such as heavy weapons teams and special weapons teams and the like, the Commissar can make sure they aren't running away that easily. Most of the time you won't find yourself executing things to re-roll, because by the time you've failed your morale tests, you usually have so many casualties that regardless of what you do, you're not gonna make up for the fact that you've shot one of your troops already. Wyrdvane Psykers are also in 3 stars. They're definitely the weakest of the Psykers, just in general. However, it is very important to have some sort of psychic power in your army. Psykers are just really good in this edition in general. You need something that's able to deny the witch, and you might as well have some psychic might on the field if you're already bringing something to deny it. At their relatively low points cost, just being able to throw a d6 out there to maybe deny a smite or 2 is worth it in my opinion. Next up is the Ogryn Bodyguard. The Ogryn Bodyguard is okay for keeping your characters alive. In general, I don't think bodyguard units are that great, but if your local meta involves a lot of snipers, a bodyguard is good to throw in, and the Ogryns have decent toughness, as well as a reasonable amount of wounds to be able to protect things. Throw in a decent ballistic skill and a good weapons skill, and you have yourself a good all-around unit. Next up in 3 stars is the regular Ogryn themselves. They have decent guns, and they are good in melee. There's not really much to talk about with them, to be honest. I feel like they get outshined by Bullgryns, because Bullgryns do melee better than Ogryns, but Ogryns are an option. Next up in the 3-star category is Rattlings. Last chapter approved they got nerfed up to 7 points. Then they got their ability reworked, that means that they can no longer deploy within 9 inches of any enemy units. It also restricts the deployment zone as well. And now they've had points cut with 2019 chapter approved, so I can see Rattlings perhaps making it back in. Being able to deploy quite close to your enemy lines is very nice, especially if you can throw them in a high up spot. They have additional bonuses in their cover, and due to their low profile, they're very easy to keep completely obscured. The only real downside to Rattlings is when they get shot at, they tend to go squish pretty quickly. However, if you manage to pick off a character that's more than 50 points, which is quite easy to do considering the fact that you can spam mortal wounds on them, the Rattlings have more than made their price back. Furthermore, if you're fighting Chaos at all with Rattlings, you can throw the Vengeance Facalia on them, which allows them to re-roll their wound rolls, which improves your chances of getting those free mortal wounds to pick off annoying things like Obliterators. Next up in the 3-star category is Scout Sentinels. They get beefed up above Armoured Sentinels despite costing the same amount. The big advantage they have here is the Scout ability. The Scout ability allows you to get early board control and force your opponents to shoot them off the board, rather than targeting your more important things like Leman Russes. Next up in the 3-star category is Hydras and Manticores. We'll put them together because they're quite similar units. Hydras specialise in anti-air stuff, which is here and there. It depends on the meta. If you're coming up against a lot of Eldar, the Hydras are okay at dealing with them. And as for the Manticore, it really is quite restrictive because of the number of shots it can put out, limited to 4 per game. They're better than Deathstrike missile launchers, but not fantastic. Next up on the 3-star is the Valkyries. The Valkyries do a bit of two things when they're in the air. They're a bit of a gunship and they're a bit of a transport ship. They don't do anything particularly fantastically, and they certainly aren't enough to encourage a flyer guard meta, nor do they really crop up in competitive lists. Really, you can just use the Valkyries for whenever you're feeling a bit fluffy and you want to throw some guardsmen further down the line. Finally, in the 3-star category, I'm going to bundle all of these together and say Baneblades and all its variants. Most of the Baneblade variants have seen points drops, and in this version of Chapter Approved, the Baneblade, the Bane Hammer and the Bane Sword have all seen points drops further. The only one that's had a points hike has been the Shadow Sword. That's probably because it is very good at taking out knights by itself, whereas the rest of them are all kind of outclassed by knights. Especially seeing as it's so easy to super knights in place of a Baneblade or of its variants, it's very hard to justify them without them being significantly cheaper. They have a lot of firepower on them. The reason why I group them all together is because they all end up fulfilling a similar sort of role, all with a slight twist on their speciality, with the Baneblade being a bit more of a generalist, the Shadow Sword being a lot better at taking down Titanic units, and the Stormlord good at massed anti-infantry fire. In the end, they all end up being on the same chassis, and what guns you want to take on them will depend on what you're coming up against. Now we start getting into the really good stuff with 4 stars, starting with Colonel Strachan. He crops up in competitive lists here and there, and he really buffs the melee of the already strong melee sub-faction, the Catachans. Colonel Strachan also himself has very powerful melee capabilities, as well as a reasonable amount of survivability. His strength 6 is absolutely insane for a guardsman, meaning he can take on even the most fearsome of things. Tied in with his ability to reroll against monsters makes him a formidable melee combatant. Next we have Platoon Commanders. Platoon Commanders are quite simple. They give you a voice of command for cheaper than a company commander and don't take up the HQ slot if you particularly value that. Next up is the Tech Priest Engine Seer. This is good for repairing your tanks and the like, and is also a reasonably powerful elite slot filler. Bullgryns are also a 4-star unit. They are the best strictly Astra Militarum unit for melee. They have powerful melee weapons, they can have 4-up invuln saves against opponents with high AP, or 2-up regular saves against enemies with not a lot. They're tough, they have decent armor, and they can get up to strength 6 on the charge. They're very scary to come up in melee, and should be feared by even the strongest of melee combatants. Finally, in the 4-star category, we have the Leman Russ tank. Leman Russes have actually seen a points cut in the most recent Chapter Approved. However, tank commanders are so strong that they are probably still better to take than the Leman Russ. The problems with the Leman Russ come in the fact that it's hard to get tank commands on them, when tank commanders can just apply them to themselves. The only reason you might not have that is if you have Knight Commander Pask. Pask is probably the only reason you'd actually take regular Leman Russes, at least before the points cut. Now there is a somewhat reasonable precedent to take a Leman Russ instead of a tank commander if you're strapped for points. But Leman Russes in general, or at least the chassis of a Leman Russ, is very powerful. Being able to fire twice with some of the strongest high AP, high damage weaponry is very good, especially seeing as the battle cannon can shoot up to 72 inches, which is almost the entirety of a board. Now we get to the final, really strong stuff. Let's start with the company commander. Being able to give 2 voice of commands on a single unit is really strong. Being able to give 2 voice of commands on a strong unit that has an invuln save and also only costs 30 points is absolutely insane. Company commanders are such good value for points. They aren't the best melee combatants or shooters, but as a support unit, they are very good. Next up, we have Tank Commanders. Tank Commanders are Leman Russes with 3-up ballistic skills and the ability to give tank commands. While most of the tank commands aren't astounding, the Cadian one is really strong, and Guller's Kill on Sight is also really good for non-Cadians. You can also use the slightly more situational ones like Strike and Shroud, which can be good in some situations. The best thing about tank commanders is that they can give these tank orders to themselves. If they couldn't, or if they could hand out 2, I feel like tank commanders might see a bit less play, or if they cost too many points and you just default to Leman Russes instead. Another 5-star is Knight Commander Pask. he has the ability to give out 2 tank orders. Aside from being able to give 2 tank orders, he also has a better ballistic skill, which is really good considering how powerful the tank weapons are. You even get to choose which tank weapons you want to take, which usually is the battle cannon because the battle cannon has such insane range for how good it is. The other ones can be situationally good, but most of the time you just rather take the battle cannon. Another 5-star is the Chimera Psyker. You're seeing a theme here with a lot of the Guard HQs being in 5 stars. Well, this one is really good because it is the best default Psyker that the Guard can take. They have just regular psychic abilities unlike every other Guard unit, but despite being the most boring of the Psykers, what they make up for it is with how cheap they are. Like, if you're comparing it to, say, the Weird Boy from the Orcs, the Weird Boy costs 62 points. The Chimera Psyker is as low as 38, which is almost half the price of it. Not only that, they take up HQ slots, which you're only really competing with the company commander with, which you only want so many of. Next up, we have the best unit in the Codex by a large margin is the Infantry Squad. The Infantry Squad are versatile, they are powerful, and they are also really good at generating command points. The reason why Guard Soup is so popular is the synergy between infantry squads and company commanders. You can get a powerful 32 unit 5 command point detachment for so incredibly cheap, and this is mostly thanks to the infantry squad. On top of that, you can specialize them into having mortars in the teams, las cannons in the team, plasma guns in the team, you name it. They are versatile, which is really good. On top of that, they are incredibly cheap for how powerful they are as well, at only 4 points. Although if they were to go any higher, they'd probably tumble down the list very far. They're in the most perfect spot where they are right now. Next up in the 5 stars is the Astropath. The Astropath saw a points cut despite turning up in quite a few competitive lists. Once again, this is due to the fact that Psykers are important, and cheap Psykers are really good. The main downside of the Astropath is that their smite is kind of weak, but the ability to get good Deny the Witches is enough to be able to slide them into competitive lists, although I can see this being dropped in friendly games. Next up is the Heavy Weapons Squad. The main thing that makes Heavy Weapons Squads good is the mortars. Now, mortars got a nerf in chapter approved. However, las cannons also got a buff. Whether or not either of these things is enough to make heavy weapons team change up their loadout is hard to say really. The reason why mortars were so good is because all the weapons that heavy weapons teams can take, unsurprisingly, are heavy. The problem with heavy weapons is if you move to fire them you suffer a -1 to hit. The problem with the non-mortar weapons is that they need to have line of sight, and the problem with that is the enemy will typically keep the targets that you want to shoot with your heavy weapons teams out of line of sight. However, you can use them as effectively like a choke point holder with their cheaper powerful weapons. Alternatively, you can put pressure on them with the mortars still, although with the price hike of the mortars I can see it being a bit harder to justify them. Being able to shell your opponent without them being able to strike back is very strong, and I could easily see them staying in the 5-star category. Another 5-star unit is the Basilisk. Same thing as the mortars and the heavy weapon squads. Being able to shell your opponents from a position that they can't strike back is really powerful. The same thing goes for the Wyverns as well, although the Wyverns have seen a points hike in chapter approved. The difference between the two is the Wyverns specialise at clearing out large amounts of infantry, like orcs, tyranids, or other things that have around a toughness of 4. Whereas the Basilisks specialise in taking out high-value targets that you wouldn't necessarily be able to reach, like Leman Russes. All in all, I can see the Basilisks perhaps being favoured a bit more over Wyverns, and I can see Wyverns tumbling down to 4, maybe even 3 stars. That's everything. That's all the units from the Guards Codex, as well as some units that were released after the Guards Codex. I'd love to hear what you think about my list. Maybe I got some things wrong. Maybe Command Squad's the secret hidden OP that I didn't think about. Either way, thank you for watching the video. I hope you like, subscribe, and whatever else you're supposed to do on YouTube. That would be super appreciated. I don't know if I'm going to revise this list as quickly as I revised the Orcs list. Perhaps when the next edition rolls around I might consider doing it, but as it stands I think I'm going to knock out a few more Codex reviews. Alright, thank you for listening.